The red sun of Keth Prime cast long shadows across the rocky ground as Captain Jake Morrison walked through the alien city. 6 months had passed since he arrived on this world, and he still felt amazed by the sight of the Cathera people. They looked like giant cats that walked on 2 legs, with sharp claws and teeth that could tear through metal. Most humans feared them, but Jake had learned to see past their scary appearance. The Cathera were proud warriors who had ruled this part of space for thousands of years. Their cities were built from black stone, with tall towers that reached toward the sky. Everything about their world spoke of strength and power. But Jake had noticed something else during his time here. He had seen doubt in the eyes of their young ones. Jake stopped at his usual spot near the training grounds where young Cathera practiced their fighting skills. 3 cubs always watched him from the shadows. They thought they were hidden, but Jake's military training had taught him to notice everything around him. The cubs were almost adults by Cathera standards, their fur still showing the spots of youth, but their bodies growing strong and tall. The first cub was called Razor of Stars. His black fur gleamed in the sunlight, and his yellow eyes missed nothing. He was the smartest of the 3, always asking questions that made the adults uncomfortable. The second was Swift Through Shadow, a female with silver fur who moved like water flowing over rocks. She was the fastest runner Jake had ever seen. The third cub was Blood on Wind, whose red fur matched his fierce spirit. He was strong enough to bend metal bars with his bare hands. Jake had been sent to Keth Prime as part of a peace program between humans and Cathera. His job was to share human military knowledge and learn about Cathera fighting methods. Most of the adult warriors treated him with cold respect, but these 3 cubs seemed different. They watched him with curious eyes instead of suspicious ones. One day, Jake decided to acknowledge their presence. He turned toward their hiding spot and said, "You can come out if you want to talk." The cubs froze like deer caught in headlights. After a moment of whispered discussion, they slowly approached him. Razor of Stars spoke first, his voice careful and polite. "Human Jake, we mean no disrespect by watching you." Jake smiled and sat down on a nearby rock to make himself less threatening. "I don't mind. I'm curious about your people, too." Swift Through Shadow tilted her head, studying him. "You are not afraid of us like other humans?" Jake shook his head. "Fear doesn't help anyone. I'd rather understand than be afraid." Blood on Wind growled softly, which Jake had learned was a sign of confusion among young Cathera. "But we are predators. We are made to hunt and kill." Jake looked at the young warrior with steady eyes. "Being able to kill doesn't mean you have to kill. Humans are predators too, but we choose how to use our strength." This began a series of secret meetings between Jake and the 3 cubs. They would find him during his daily walks and ask him questions about human ways. Jake told them stories about human soldiers who fought to protect innocent people. He explained how human warriors earned respect not by killing the weak, but by defending those who could not defend themselves. The cubs listened with growing fascination. They asked about human tactics, about working as a team instead of fighting alone, about the idea that true strength came from protecting others. These conversations planted seeds of doubt about their own traditions, especially about the sacred hunt that was approaching. The sacred hunt was the most important ritual in Cathera culture. When cubs reached adulthood, they had to hunt and kill a sentient being to prove their worth. The prey were usually captured members of weaker species, traders, explorers, or refugees who had been unlucky enough to cross Cathera space. The hunt was supposed to teach young Cathara that they were apex predators, born to rule over lesser beings. But as the day of their hunt approached, the three cubs found themselves questioning everything they had been taught. Raiser of Stars had nightmares about killing innocent creatures. Swift Through Shadow wondered if speed should be used to save lives instead of ending them. Blood on Wind began to think that real strength might mean protecting the weak rather than destroying them. Their parents noticed the change in their behavior. Elder Claw of Midnight, Swift Through Shadow's mother, was particularly concerned. She was a respected member of the Warrior Council and could not understand why her daughter was asking strange questions about the necessity of the hunt. The other parents shared her worry. War Chief Bone Crusher, the leader of their clan, called a meeting with the cubs' families. "The human is poisoning their minds with soft ideas," he declared, his massive frame casting a shadow over the gathered adults. Cubs who question the sacred hunt are cubs who will never become true warriors. Elder Claw of Midnight's voice carried the weight of tradition. "The hunt has made us strong for 10,000 years. It teaches us that we are predators, not prey. Without it, we become weak like the creatures we rule over." But despite their parents' concerns, the cubs continued to seek out Jake's company. Jake noticed their growing distress as their hunt day approached. He could see the conflict in their eyes, the desire to please their families fighting against their growing belief that killing innocents was wrong. Jake wished he could help them, but he knew that interfering with Cathara culture could cause a diplomatic disaster. The cubs' questions became more desperate. What would happen to a human soldier who refused to fight? Raiser of Stars asked one day. Jake thought carefully before answering. It would depend on what kind of fight it was. A human soldier who refused to defend innocent people would be a coward. But a soldier who refused to kill innocent people would be showing courage. Swift Through Shadow's ears flattened against her head. But our elders say that showing mercy makes us weak. Jake shook his head slowly. I've seen mercy make people stronger than any weapon ever could. The hardest battles are often fought not with claws or guns, but with the choice to do what's right, even when everyone else says you're wrong. As the sacred hunt drew closer, tension filled the air like a storm about to break. The three cubs had to make a choice that would change not just their own lives, but the future of their entire people. They had learned about a different kind of strength from the human among them, and now they had to decide if they were brave enough to follow that path, even if it meant standing alone against thousands of years of tradition. The morning of the sacred hunt arrived with dark clouds covering the red sun. Jake woke early, knowing this would be one of the hardest days of his mission. He had tried to stay neutral about Cathara customs, but learning the truth about the hunt had sickened him to his core. 3 days earlier, Jake had been invited to witness the preparation of the hunting grounds. What he saw there would haunt him forever. The prey were not wild animals or enemy soldiers. They were innocent beings from peaceful species. He saw a young trader from the gentle Zephyrian race, her blue skin marked with tears as she huddled in a cage. There was an elderly scholar from the Mindari people, his tentacles trembling with fear as he tried to comfort a frightened child from his species. These were not criminals or invaders. They were travelers, merchants, and refugees who had been captured by Cathara raiders, specifically for the hunt. Some had families searching for them across the galaxy. Others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when Cathara hunting parties needed fresh prey for the coming ritual. Jake had wanted to free them all, but his diplomatic status meant he could not interfere with Cathara traditions without causing an interstellar incident. The peace between humans and Cathara was too fragile and too important for him to risk it on an emotional response. But knowing he had to stand by and watch innocents die ate at his soul like acid. The three cubs found Jake sitting alone in his quarters that evening, staring out at the alien stars. They could sense his distress even through their different biology. Razor of Stars was the first to speak, his young voice heavy with understanding. "You have seen the prey, haven't you, human Jake?" Jake nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak at first. When he finally found his voice, it came out rough with emotion. "I have seen them, and I have seen you three struggling with what you're being asked to do." Swift Through Shadow moved closer, her silver fur catching the starlight. "We have been having the dark dreams again. Dreams where we kill and kill, but feel no joy, only emptiness." Blood on Wind's red fur bristled with agitation. "The elders say these dreams will pass once we taste our first kill. They say the hunt will awaken our true nature and make us feel complete." Jake turned to face the three young warriors, seeing his own pain reflected in their alien eyes. "What do you think? Do you believe that killing innocents will make you complete?" The cubs exchanged glances, and Jake could see they had already been discussing this among themselves. Razor of Stars spoke for all of them. "We think it will make us empty inside. We think it will kill something important in our hearts." Jake felt a surge of pride for these young beings who were brave enough to question everything they had been taught. "Then what will you do?" Jake asked quietly. The cubs looked at each other again, and Jake could see them making a decision that would change their lives forever. Swift Through Shadow straightened her shoulders, suddenly looking more adult than she ever had before. "We want to know what humans do to prove they are worthy. We want to know how your people become warriors without killing innocents." Jake chose his words carefully, knowing how important this moment was. Human warriors prove themselves by protecting others. We become strong by standing up for what is right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. We earn respect by using our power to help those who cannot help themselves. Blood on Wind leaned forward, his yellow eyes intense. "Even if everyone else says you are wrong, even if your own family turns against you?" "Especially then," Jake replied. "It's easy to do the right thing when everyone agrees with you." Real. Courage means doing what's right even when you stand alone. The cubs sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of Jake's words. Finally, Razor of Stars stood up, his decision clear in his posture. "Then we will follow the human way of honor." The day of the sacred hunt dawned with the sound of drums echoing across the city. Hundreds of Cathara gathered in the great arena to watch their young ones prove their worth. The three cubs stood with their age mates, all dressed in traditional hunting gear. But while the other young warriors seemed excited or nervous, Jake's three friends looked calm and determined. War Chief Bone Crusher stood before the assembled crowd, his massive frame impressive even among the giant Cathara. His voice boomed across the arena as he spoke the ancient words of the hunting ritual. "Today, our cubs become warriors. Today they prove they are predators, not prey. Today they join the ranks of the strong by showing they can kill without mercy." The captured beings were released into the hunting ground, a maze of rocks and caves designed to give them a small chance of hiding while ensuring they could not escape. Jake watched from the diplomatic viewing area, his hands clenched into fists as he forced himself to remain still. He had given the cubs his advice, but now they had to make their own choice. One by one, the young Cathara entered the hunting ground. Jake could hear the sounds of pursuit echoing from the maze. Running feet, frightened cries, the roars of young predators. Some hunts ended quickly with screams that cut off suddenly. Others dragged on as clever prey tried desperately to stay, alive for a few more precious minutes. Then it was time for Razor of Stars, Swift Through Shadow, and Blood on Wind to enter the maze. The three cubs looked up at Jake in the viewing area, and he gave them a small nod of encouragement. Whatever they chose to do, he would be proud of them for following their conscience. The cubs walked into the hunting ground together, which was unusual since the hunt was traditionally done alone. The crowd murmured with confusion as they watched the three young warriors move through the maze without the aggressive posture expected from hunters. They moved carefully, quietly, but not like predators stalking prey, more like soldiers on a rescue mission. Minutes passed, then an hour. No screams came from their section of the maze. No sounds of killing reached the waiting crowd. The other young hunters had all returned with their trophies, the torn bodies of innocent beings they had killed to prove their worth. But Jake's three friends remained in the maze, and their assigned prey remained alive. Finally, the drums sounded the end of the hunt. All survivors, both hunters and prey, were supposed to return to the arena. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Razor of Stars, Swift Through Shadow, and Blood on Wind emerged from the maze empty-handed. Behind them walked their assigned prey, a family of small, furry beings who should have been dead, but were instead unharmed and confused. War Chief Bonecrusher's roar of rage shook the arena. What is the meaning of this? Why do these prey still live? Why do these cubs return without trophies? The three young Cathara walked to the center of the arena, their heads held high despite the angry murmurs from the crowd. Razor of Stars stepped forward and spoke in a clear voice that carried across the entire arena. We refuse to participate in the sacred hunt. We refuse to kill innocents to prove our worth. We choose instead to follow the human way of honor, to prove ourselves by protecting others, not by destroying them. The arena erupted in chaos. Some Cathara roared in outrage at this unprecedented defiance. Others stood in shocked silence, unable to process what they had just heard. War Chief Bonecrusher's eyes blazed with fury as he pointed his massive claw at the three cubs. You dare reject the ways of your ancestors? You dare spit on 10,000 years of tradition? You are no longer Cathara. You are outcasts, exiled, from your clans and your world. Elder Claw of Midnight stood up in the crowd, her voice breaking with pain and rage. My daughter chooses the path of weakness over strength. She brings shame upon our entire lineage. But the three cubs stood firm, their resolve unshaken by the condemnation of their people. Swift Through Shadow looked up at her mother and spoke, with quiet dignity. We choose the path that lets us sleep without nightmares. We choose the path that makes us proud of our strength, instead of ashamed of it. Jake felt his heart swell with pride for these brave young beings who had chosen to do what was right despite the cost. But he also knew that their troubles were just beginning, and that bigger challenges lay ahead for all of them. The emergency alarm screamed across Keth Prime like a wounded animal. Jake rushed from his quarters to the command center, where chaos ruled supreme. Cathara warriors ran in every direction while emergency lights painted everything in harsh red. The great viewing screens showed a sight that made Jake's blood run cold. Hundreds of black ships descending from the void like deadly rain. Commander Alex Burton, Jake's human liaison, grabbed his arm as he entered. The Void Swarm has returned. Jake, they're hitting our outer colonies and Cathara outposts simultaneously. This isn't a raid. This is full-scale war. Jake stared at the screens showing the mechanical ships of humanity's oldest enemy. The Void Swarm were not living beings, but artificial minds that consumed entire worlds, turning everything into more of themselves. War Chief Bonecrusher stood before the tactical display, his massive frame tense with rage and fear. They dare attack during our sacred hunt season? They mock our traditions with their timing. Elder Claw of Midnight moved beside him, her silver fur streaked with worry. The outer settlements report complete destruction. No survivors, no prisoners taken. They consume everything in their path. Jake studied the attack patterns and felt sick. The swarm ships were not just attacking military targets. They were systematically harvesting civilian populations. Men, women, and children from dozens of species were being taken to feed the swarm's endless hunger for biological material. This was exactly the kind of fight that human and Cathara forces were supposed to prevent through their alliance. A younger Cathara warrior burst into the command center, his fur matted with sweat from running. "War Chief, the first defense fleet is gone. Admiral Clawrender's flagship was destroyed with all hands. The enemy ships adapt to our weapons faster than we can adjust our tactics." Bonecrusher's roar shook the walls as he slammed his fist into the tactical table. Jake stepped forward, his mind already working on the problem. "Chief, we need to combine our forces. Human ships have different weapons and tactics than Cathara vessels. If we coordinate properly, we might be able to keep them from adapting so quickly." The war chief turned his burning eyes on Jake, and for a moment, the human thought he might be attacked. "Your soft human ways brought shame to our cubs, and now you dare give tactical advice to warriors?" Bonecrusher snarled. But before Jake could respond, another alarm sounded. The screens showed swarm ships beginning orbital bombardment of the city's outskirts. Civilian shelters were being targeted specifically, and thousands of innocent Cathara were dying every minute. Elder Claw of Midnight placed her hand on Bonecrusher's arm, her voice urgent. "This is not the time for pride, old friend. My mate was killed in the first wave. Our traditional hunting tactics failed against these mechanical monsters. Perhaps it is time to try something different." The war chief looked ready to argue, but another explosion shook the building. Jake seized the moment. "I have a plan, but it requires volunteers for extremely dangerous missions. We need small teams that can infiltrate swarm ships and disable them from within. It can't be done by ships or long-range weapons. Someone has to get inside those vessels and tear out their electronic hearts." The gathered Cathara warriors shifted uncomfortably. This was not their way of fighting. "No Cathara warrior hides like a coward," growled one of the younger fighters. "We face our enemies with honor, claw to claw." Jake shook his head. "This isn't about hiding. This is about being smart enough to win. The swarm doesn't care about honor. They only understand destruction. We have to beat them with tactics they can't adapt to." Before anyone could respond, 3 familiar voices spoke from the entrance to the command center. "We volunteer." Jake turned to see Razor of Stars, Swift Through Shadow, and Blood on Wind standing together. They had been declared outcasts only hours before, but now they stood ready to fight for their people, despite their rejection. War Chief Bonecrusher's eyes blazed with fresh anger. "Outcasts have no place in this battle. You rejected our ways, so you have no right to defend our world." But Swift Through Shadow stepped forward, her young voice carrying surprising authority. We rejected killing innocents, not protecting our people. If you want to save Keth Prime, you need warriors who can learn new ways of fighting." Elder Claw of Midnight looked at her daughter with mixed emotions. Pride and pain warred in her ancient eyes as she spoke. "You would risk your lives for people who have cast you out?" Raiser of Stars answered for all three cubs. "We would risk our lives for what is right. These mechanical monsters kill cubs and elders without mercy. Someone must stop them." Jake felt a surge of hope. These three young warriors had already shown they could think beyond tradition. If anyone could learn the new tactics needed to fight the swarm, it would be them. "Chief, I need them. Their natural abilities combined with human tactics might be our only chance." Bone Crusher looked ready to refuse, but another report arrived that changed everything. "War Chief, the swarm has taken the Children's Sanctuary on Keth Secondary. 3,000 cubs are being processed for harvest." The color drained from Bone Crusher's face. The Children's Sanctuary held the youngest members of multiple clans, cubs too small to defend themselves, kept safe while their parents fought in the outer systems. The three outcast cubs stepped closer to Jake, their decision already made. Blood on Wind spoke with quiet determination. "Human Jake taught us that real warriors protect those who cannot protect themselves. We will follow his tactics and save our people, even if our people no longer claim us." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "All right, but this won't be like anything you've trained for. Swarm ships are mechanical. Mazes filled with death traps. You'll need to move like ghosts, strike like lightning, and think 3 steps ahead of enemies that learn from every mistake." Swift Through Shadows' silver fur rippled with anticipation. "We are ready to learn." Jake began immediate tactical training with the three cubs, while the battle raged in space above them. He taught them about electronic warfare, about finding weak points in mechanical systems, about moving through enemy territory without being detected. The cubs proved to be exceptional students, their natural predator instincts adapting perfectly to these new forms of hunting. Other young Cathara began gathering around the training area, watching with growing interest despite their elders' disapproval. These younger warriors had grown up hearing stories about the legendary Void Swarm, and they could see that traditional tactics were failing against the mechanical enemy. Jake's methods offered something new, a way to strike back against monsters that seemed unstoppable. Raiser of Stars mastered the art of reading electronic patterns, learning to see the flow of data through swarm systems like tracks in the wilderness. Swift Through Shadow discovered that her incredible speed could be used to move through mechanical corridors faster than automated defenses could target her. Blood on Wind found that his strength could tear through metal barriers with surgical precision, creating entry points where none existed before. As word of their training spread, more young Cathara began asking to join. These volunteers faced immediate exile from their clans for following the outcast cubs, but they came anyway. They had seen their traditional warriors die in the opening battles, and they knew that survival required adaptation. Jake found himself commanding a growing force of young rebels who called themselves his pack. They moved with purpose that reminded him of human special forces, but retained the lethal grace that made Cathara such formidable predators. For the first time since the swarm returned, Jake began to believe they might have a chance. But the enemy was learning too. Swarm ships began targeting civilian populations specifically to draw Jake's pack into rescue missions. The mechanical minds had identified this new threat and were adapting their tactics to exploit the one weakness they could find. The human-trained warriors could not ignore cries for help. The real test was coming, and Jake knew that everything would depend on whether his young warriors could learn fast enough to stay ahead of an enemy that never stopped evolving. The swarm harvest ship hung in space like a mechanical spider, its dark hull bristling with weapons and sensors. Inside its belly, thousands of human civilians from the agricultural colony of New Terra waited in processing chambers, unaware that death would come within hours if no one reached them in time. Jake floated in the cargo bay of their stolen swarm shuttle, checking his equipment one final time. The three cubs, no longer cubs but seasoned warriors after weeks of desperate training, prepared their gear with the focused calm of professional soldiers. Their transformation amazed him every day. "Remember, we move fast and quiet," Jake whispered into his comm unit. "The swarm learns from every encounter, so we can't use the same tactics twice." Razor of Stars nodded, his black fur barely visible in the shuttle's dim light. His enhanced senses had proven invaluable for navigating the mechanical mazes of enemy ships. Swift Through Shadow checked her modified claws, each one now tipped with devices that could slice through electronic systems as easily as flesh. The thermal scans show 3,000 life signs in the processing center. We have maybe 2 hours before they begin the harvest. Blood on Wind flexed his massive hands, testing the portable breaching charges Jake had taught him to use. 2 hours is enough if we move like the human showed us. The shuttle docked with the harvest ship using stolen authorization codes. Jake held his breath as mechanical systems scanned their vessel, hoping the swarm's own technology would fool their sensors. After a tense moment, the docking clamps engaged, and the airlock opened with a soft hiss. Jake led the way into corridors that hummed with alien machinery. The walls were lined with cables and pipes that pulsed with unknown energy. The air smelled of metal and ozone, nothing like the warm scents of living ships. Every surface was perfectly clean and geometrically precise, as if designed by minds that had never known organic chaos. The cubs moved behind Jake like living shadows, their natural stealth enhanced by everything he had taught them about military infiltration. Razor of Stars paused at each intersection, his sensitive hearing tracking the movement of mechanical patrols. Swift Through Shadow scouted ahead using ventilation shafts that were too small for humans, but perfect for her lean frame. Blood on Wind covered their rear, ready to tear through any enemy that discovered them. They encountered their first swarm unit in a junction near the ship's core. The machine was humanoid but clearly artificial, with glowing red sensors instead of eyes and limbs that moved with mechanical precision. Jake signaled for silence and approached from behind, using techniques learned in dozens of covert operations. But before Jake could strike, Swift Through Shadow dropped from the ceiling, like a falling star. Her claws found the exact spots Jake had taught her to target, and the mechanical warrior died without making a sound. She looked back at Jake with pride, and he realized his students had become his equals. They made their way deeper into the ship, disabling security systems and avoiding patrols with growing confidence. The cubs used their natural abilities in ways Jake had never imagined possible. Razor of Stars could hear the electronic heartbeat of the ship itself, predicting where enemies would appear before they came into view. Swift Through Shadow moved through the mechanical corridors like water flowing around obstacles. Blood on Wind's strength let him open sealed doors and tear through barriers that would stop ordinary soldiers. The processing center was a vast chamber filled with transparent cells, each one holding terrified humans from the colony. Jake saw farmers and teachers, children and elderly people, all waiting to be consumed by the swarm's endless hunger. The sight filled him with cold rage, but also with determination to save every single life. "The control systems are there," Jake pointed, to a raised platform surrounded by mechanical interfaces. "We disable those, and the cells will open automatically." But as they moved toward their target, alarms began screaming throughout the ship. Red lights flashed, and mechanical voices announced the discovery of intruders. "They found our shuttle." Blood on Wind growled, his sensitive nose detecting the scent of melting metal through the ship's air systems. "We're trapped here until we complete the mission." Jake smiled grimly. These young warriors had learned his lessons well. The mission came first, their own safety second. Swarm units poured into the processing center from multiple entrances. These were not the simple patrol units they had encountered before, but specialized combat machines designed to kill intruders. Their weapons could cut through metal, and their sensors could track movement in complete darkness. But Jake's pack had advantages that no previous enemies had possessed. They fought with the tactical knowledge of human special forces combined, with the natural weapons and instincts of apex predators. Jake used his sidearm to provide covering fire while the cubs struck with devastating precision. Razor of Stars used his enhanced hearing to predict enemy movements, calling out warnings that let his packmates dodge attacks that should have been impossible to avoid. Swift Through Shadow became a silver blur of motion, too fast for mechanical reflexes to track. She struck and vanished, leaving destroyed enemies in her wake. Blood on Wind used his massive strength to tear enemy weapons from their mechanical hands, then turned those weapons against their former owners. His roars of challenge echoed through the chamber, and Jake realized the young warrior was enjoying himself for the first time since the war began. Working together, they fought their way to the control platform. Jake's fingers flew over alien interfaces, while the cubs protected him from waves of mechanical attackers. The cubs had learned to fight as a team, each one supporting the others in ways their individualistic culture had never taught them. "Got it!" Jake shouted as the cell doors began opening throughout the chamber. Thousands of human civilians stumbled free, confused and terrified but alive. "Now we need to get them to the escape pods before the swarm sends reinforcements." The cubs immediately began herding civilians toward the emergency exits, their intimidating appearance actually helping to keep the panicked humans moving in the right direction. As they fought their way through the ship with thousands of rescued civilians, Jake realized something important had changed. The cubs were no longer following his orders. They were thinking ahead, anticipating problems, making tactical decisions on their own. They had become true warriors, not just physically, but mentally. Swift Through Shadow took point, scouting, safe routes for the civilian convoy. Razor of Stars monitored enemy communications, warning of ambushes before they could be sprung. Blood on Wind covered the rear, his massive frame serving as a mobile fortress that protected the weakest refugees. They reached the escape pod bays just as swarm reinforcements arrived in overwhelming numbers. Jake knew they could not fight there, way through such a large force while protecting civilians. But the cubs had already thought of a solution. "Human Jake, take the civilians and go," Swift Through Shadow said, her silver fur matted with sweat and mechanical lubricants. "We will hold them here long enough for everyone to escape." Jake started to protest, but Razor of Stars cut him off. "You taught us that protecting others is more important than our own lives. Now let us prove we learned the lesson." Jake felt his heart swell with pride even as it broke with fear for these brave young warriors. He helped load the last civilians into escape pods, then turned for one final look at his students. They stood together facing an army of mechanical killers, ready to die so that innocence could live. But as Jake's pod launched toward safety, he heard something that made him smile despite his tears. The cubs were not roaring in fear or desperation. They were calling out tactical instructions to each other, working as a perfect team even in the face of certain death. They had learned everything he could teach them, and they were using that knowledge to save lives. The rescue mission succeeded beyond Jake's wildest hopes. 3,000 human civilians reached safety, and word of the Cubs' heroism spread throughout, both human and Cathara space. Young warriors from a dozen worlds began asking to learn Jake's tactics, and for the first time since the war began, there was hope that the swarm could be defeated. The blue marble of New Geneva hung in space like a jewel, but death surrounded it on all sides. The Void Swarm had brought their entire fleet to Jake's home world, thousands of mechanical ships that blotted out the stars. This was their final gambit: harvest the planet where their greatest enemy had been born, and break the spirit of all who opposed them. Jake stood on the bridge of the human cruiser Liberty, watching his childhood home prepare for its last battle. Somewhere down there were the fields where he had played as a boy, the school where he had learned to dream of exploring the stars, the cemetery where his parents lay buried beneath alien soil. Now all of it would be consumed unless his impossible plan somehow worked. Admiral Patricia Hayes, the fleet commander, shook her head as she studied the tactical displays. "Jake, there are too many of them. Even with the Cathara reinforcements, we're outnumbered 10 to 1. Our conventional fleets won't last an hour against that armada." Jake nodded grimly, but his attention was focused on the smaller ships gathering near the fleet's edge. 50 young Cathara warriors floated in modified assault craft, their sleek forms barely visible against the black of space. These were the volunteers who had followed Jake's 3 original students, young rebels who had abandoned their traditional culture to learn a new way of war. They called themselves Jake's Pack, and they represented the future of both species. Razor of Stars, Swift Through Shadow, and Blood on Wind commanded the 3 lead ships. They were no longer the confused cubs who had questioned their elders months ago. They were seasoned warriors who had saved thousands of lives and inspired a revolution in military thinking. Their voices came over the communication channel with calm confidence. "Human Jake, we are ready," Swift Through Shadow reported, her silver fur gleaming under the harsh lights of her cockpit. "The Pack understands the mission parameters." Jake smiled despite the desperate situation. These young warriors had mastered not just human tactics, but human military language, speaking with the precision of trained soldiers. The plan was insane even by Jake's standards. While the human and Cathara fleets engaged the swarm's main force, Jake's Pack would penetrate to the enemy command ship and disable the central intelligence that coordinated the entire armada. It required perfect timing, flawless execution, and more luck than any reasonable person would expect. But Jake had learned that reasonable expectations did not apply to warriors who fought for something greater than themselves. These young Cathara had already achieved the impossible by abandoning their culture's most sacred traditions. Now they would attempt something even more difficult, working together as a single organism instead of individual hunters. "Remember, you move as one mind in 50 bodies," Jake said into his communicator. "Every warrior supports every other warrior. No one fights alone. No one dies alone." The response came back in unison from all 50 young voices, speaking words that would have been blasphemous to their elders but had become sacred to them. We are Jake's pack. We protect the innocent. We stand together. The battle began with the thunder of 1,000 weapons firing simultaneously. Human ships armed with plasma cannons and nuclear missiles engaged swarm vessels that adapted to each attack within seconds. Cathara warships, their hulls covered in traditional clan markings, closed to ramming distance where their superior strength could tell. Jake watched the tactical display with growing horror as both human and Cathara ships died under the swarms. Relentless assault. The mechanical fleet was learning from every exchange, becoming more efficient with each passing minute. Admiral Hayes was right. Conventional tactics would not win this battle. But Jake's pack moved through the chaos like ghosts dancing through a hurricane. They used every lesson Jake had taught them about stealth, misdirection, and coordinated assault. Razor of Stars led them through gaps in the enemy formation that existed for only seconds at a time. Swift through shadows, incredible reflexes kept them ahead of targeting systems that should have destroyed them instantly. Blood on Wind commanded the assault teams that would board the command ship once they reached it. His warriors carried weapons designed by human engineers, but modified with Cathara claws and fangs. They were prepared to fight in close quarters against enemies that felt no fear and knew no mercy. As the pack approached the massive command ship, Jake saw something that made his heart race with both pride and terror. Elder Claw of Midnight and War Chief Bone Crusher had arrived with a fleet of traditional Cathara warriors, ignoring direct orders to remain in defensive positions. They were coming to support their exiled young ones, even if it meant their own destruction. My daughter, Elder Claw of Midnight's voice came over the communication channel, thick with emotion. I was wrong to cast you out. Your strength comes, not from killing innocents, but from protecting them. I see that now. Swift Through Shadow's response was calm, but filled with love that transcended species boundaries. Mother, we fight not for glory, but for the future. Help us show our people that true warriors serve life, not death. The traditional Cathara fleet changed formation, moving to support Jake's pack instead of engaging in individual duels. For the first time in their history, Cathara warriors were fighting as a coordinated army instead of lone hunters. The assault on the command ship was a nightmare of mechanical defenders and automated death traps. Jake's pack moved through corridors that shifted and changed, trying to trap them with walls that closed like giant jaws. But they had learned to think beyond the limitations of their biology, using human tactical knowledge to overcome obstacles that would have stopped traditional warriors. They fought with a unity that amazed even Jake. When Razor of Stars was wounded, by mechanical tentacles, Blood on Wind carried him while Swift Through Shadow covered their retreat. When enemy reinforcements threatened to overwhelm them, traditional Cathara warriors led by War Chief Bone Crusher smashed through the ship's hull to provide support. The central intelligence chamber was a vast sphere filled with floating mechanical components and streams of data that moved like liquid light. At its center sat the swarm's master intelligence, an artificial mind that controlled thousands of ships and millions of mechanical warriors. It was beautiful in its alien perfection and absolutely without mercy. Jake led the final assault personally, knowing that this moment would determine the fate of two species. But as they reached the intelligence core, mechanical defenders struck with desperate fury. Jake found himself separated from his warriors, facing enemies that seemed to anticipate his every move. A mechanical claw tore through his armor, sending him sprawling across the chamber floor. As Jake struggled to rise, he saw one of the cubs, swift through shadow, throw herself between him and a killing blow. The mechanical weapon that should have ended Jake's life instead tore through her silver fur, and she collapsed with blood spreading across the pristine floor. "No," Jake whispered, crawling toward the wounded warrior who had become like a daughter to him. But swift through shadow raised her head, her eyes still burning with determination. "Complete the mission, human Jake. Show them what we learned." Her words gave Jake the strength to stand and face the Central Intelligence one final time. But he was not alone. Razor of Stars and Blood on Wind stood beside him, their young faces marked with grief, but unbroken by despair. Around them, 50 young warriors waited for orders, ready to die for the values Jake had taught them. Even War Chief Bone Crusher and Elder Claw of Midnight had reached the chamber, their traditional weapons raised against mechanical enemies. "We are Jake's pack," Razor of Stars said, his voice carrying across the chamber. "We learned that strength comes not from what we can kill, but from what we choose to protect." The young warriors moved as one organism, each supporting the others as they overwhelmed the Central Intelligence's defenses. Jake's hands flew over alien controls, using everything he knew about mechanical systems to shut down the intelligence that coordinated the entire swarm fleet. As the Master Intelligence died, thousands of mechanical ships throughout the system began drifting powerlessly through space. The battle was won, but the real victory was larger than any military triumph. Jake knelt beside Swift Through Shadow as human medics worked to save her life, and saw in her eyes the future of both species. She had proven that courage was not about killing enemies, but about protecting friends. In the months that followed, Jake watched as Cathara society transformed itself. The sacred hunt was not abandoned, but changed into something beautiful. Young warriors now proved themselves by protecting innocent beings instead of killing them. They called it Jake's Hunt, and it spread to dozens of worlds where Cathara had settled. Jake never left the pack he had trained. He spent his remaining years teaching new generations of warriors, both human and Cathara, that true strength came from choosing to write new traditions instead of blindly following old ones. And when he finally died, surrounded by warriors from a dozen species who called him teacher, his greatest students carried on his work. Swift Through Shadow, her silver fur now streaked with honorable scars, became the first Cathara to attend. Human Military Academy. Blood on Wind established schools throughout Cathara space where young warriors learned to serve life instead of death.